While this occasion keeps some of us from being at Union Square this evening to protest the senseless murder of Trayvon Martin, Professor Karla Holloway's powerful book is at its core about the very issues brought to light by this criminal incident. Mocking the absurdity of the claim that a sweatshirt could justify a fatal trigger finger, the Million Hoodie March also underscores the fact that what is at stake is far more than a sartorial matter. Taking Holloway's courageous lead in her book, Private Bodies, Public Texts, what may appear to be senseless takes on a socio-historical logic, even as it defies all reason. Drawing on deft interdisciplinary analysis, and that phrase doesn't even begin to capture what Karla does in this book. I mean, Karla is, I use the term master lightly because it's a complicated word, but she is a master of bioethics, of the literature on science, and not just genomic science, lots of bodies of literature on the science, which are distinct literatures. Of course, she's a genius at literary analysis, and now also the law. I mean, it's extraordinary what she's able to weave together seamlessly and seemingly effortlessly in this book, and it's really impressive. So drawing on deft interdisciplinary analysis, Professor Holloway shines a light on awareness of our country's stratified recognition of personhood, to borrow her words. And she reminds us that, quote, social narratives adhere to certain bodies. In the case of Trayvon Martin, the narrative was one of suspicion. The teenager was guilty on arrival, a menace to a society. Narratives such as these that adhere to certain bodies, as Karla reminds us, also implicate bioethics. For as she suggests, quote, social judgments and social systems are critical dimensions of science and medicine. And so floating in the cauldron of suspicion around the gone all too soon Trayvon Martin is the juridical and scientific constructions of this teenager as a born criminal. A born criminal such that his doe eyes, slight stature, and snacks were imperceptible to the vigilante who hunted him down and killed him. Unfathomable to this murderer was the idea that Trayvon was somebody's baby. He was merely a born criminal. Trayvon was murdered in a gated community, the ultimate symbol of privacy tied to property in American society. But as Professor Holloway makes clear, regardless of who is beyond the gates or who is propertied, those who once deemed property itself can never have privacy. Moreover, blacks and women are marked as, quote, available for, quote, intimate violations, including the cessation of life itself. The idea of the born criminal has also justified a long history of crimes against humanity, from the refusal of the private sphere and Karla's work for some to the catalog, likely incomplete, of medical experimental abuse meted out to men and women of African descent in this country for centuries that Harriet Washington has called medical apartheid. Holloway shows us that when these lives were constituted as public texts, it was their identities that were made public, quote, identities, and people have sort of talked about the way that Karla regards identity as something distinctive, through the force of social constructs and historical patterns, using her words, rather than their personhood, which was made invisible. It is the reduction of persons to identities in Holloway's framing that serves as a vehicle for invasions of privacy, for what she calls spectacularity and what she also calls hyperpublic notice. Holloway returns us to one of the most symbolically loaded of our narratives about race, medicine, and gender in this book. She revisits the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. The New York Times' disclosure of the study in 1972 alerted us to this 4 decades-long experiment in which close to 400 African-American men were left untreated for syphilis so that researchers could observe its ravages on the human body. And notably, the 40th anniversary of this revelation is this July, so there'll be a lot of conversation about that and hopefully also about your magnificent book. Holloway describes this controversy as, quote, the urtext for abuse in clinical trials. As I have written about in my recent work, the Tuskegee revelation, however, merely punctuated what black communities had long known and felt, right? It became a codification of personal experience, of apocrypha, and of nightmares for black families across the US. Yet, and in keeping Trayvon Martin in mind, as I hope we'll do in our conversation, there is, quoting Holloway, a, quote, narrative of sexuality, race, and gender that is rehearsed each time that Tuskegee and syphilis are mentioned in the same sentence, close quote. This is partly why Tuskegee persists as our main narrative about biomedical abuse, I think Karla argues very persuasively. Yet, of course, the subtext is also about in Holloway's Theoretics, identity, and about how it can come to take the place of human suffering, of loving relationships. I'm thinking here of the infected men and children, women and children of these men in the Tuskegee experiment, and how it can numb empathy. Holloway notes that black male sexual identity, again using her use of identity, is what drives part of our obsession with the Tuskegee experiment. And I think it's also notable to think about this obsession with black male sexual identity with regard to the recent comparisons between the murdered teenager who was murdered during Black History Month last month, and also the comparison of him with Emmett Till. That have reminded us that there is a sort of specter of race and sexuality haunting this incident. For example, if it's true that Trayvon Martin's killer used the phrase fucking coons, he might also be understood to have said fucking coons, literally hypercopulating black men from Trayvon to Tuskegee. So Harriet Washington and Professor Holloway write about a case here at Columbia, at Columbia University, at the Lowenstein Center for the Study and Prevention of Childhood Disruptive Disorders, in which more than 30 boys were enrolled in a study linking violence and genetics. All of the boys were described as Black Dominicans or Black and Hispanic from Washington Heights. And as Karla beautifully writes, they were doubly vulnerable because not only were they enrolled in this study and the issue of informed consent is questionable, but they were also the siblings of brothers who had had trouble with the law. So the implication was that these were born criminals, right? That they were sort of the siblings of criminal families. So the stereotypic and double vulnerability of these boys is underscored by Holloway as a variable of standard bioethics and as a subject for her own very influential, and I think will be very influential, cultural bioethics. But I just want to say to close that on February 26, Trayvon Martin was similarly doubly very vulnerable, linked in the racist imagination by conjectured blood ties to spectral-born criminals in other parts of Florida.
There are ways in which Trayvon Martin's story is too familiar. And although the individual's body here is certainly at issue, also at issue are these gun laws in 16 states that have, for whatever reasons, what we could probably enumerate them easily here, allowed people to imagine themselves threatened enough so that we would reverse the notion of threat to perception rather than actual. And I think that's a very real social process that depends on an easily imaginable body as a threat. And those are, I think, private bodies. Public text says they are women, and they are bodies that are not white or heterosexual or male.
Could you talk a little bit about the way that the fact that Zimmerman is apparently Hispanic is being leveraged, and how there's now a confusion between the terms Hispanic and white as if they're mutually exclusive, which I wasn't aware was an issue for most of America. Maybe it's because I live, in Washington Heights, or I don't know. But I didn't know that we didn't know that there are white Hispanics and black Hispanics. And is this really something that people are just using now, do you think, to kind of say, oh, well, he can't be racist and confuse the situation, or is this a genuine confusion? Because to me, it kind of seems like we're redefining race as it's convenient for this particular moment. But
You go first.
Thanks, Karla. I think actually the issue around Zimmerman's ethnicity has come up a lot, particularly in cases in New York City, which I'm most familiar with. So Sean Bell, you'll recall, some of the officers that were involved in that were Latino and perhaps even African American, and he was African American. And so it comes up because, increasingly we're in a society in which to be sort of sexist or racist, people have made it an individual sort of fault or sin, or when in fact, what these cases prove beautifully actually are long arguments about institutional racism. So whether or not he's a black Hispanic or a white Hispanic, he's a racist, and it happened because of kind of a racist imagination about black boys and men. So that's.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think what this attempts to do is to replace the real situation with a pretend argument that racism depends on what, you can only be racist if you are white, or you can only be sexist if you are male. Well, certainly, those are socially constructed and socially convenient, as you pointed out, terms. But the idea of the perpetration of a harm based on who you are is the issue, not who the person is who is the victimizer here. So I don't care what identity Zimmerman is or was. I care about what motivated his harm to this child. And that's when we can call something racist or a hate crime or whatever. So anybody who tries to tell you, oh, but these are black policemen, or they are Hispanic or Latino or whatever, they're pushing you away from the real point, and you should just tell them to hush. That's the
Carlos,
just that's not the argument. That I don't agree with your premise here. Your premise is suggesting that matters. It doesn't matter. The harm matters.
Can I quickly add something about the fact in your book? What I love the way that you lay out predictable ethical failures, and I think just as this was predictable within a socio-historical logic, although not rational or reasonable, the responses are also predictable and are as patterned as the event itself, and this just illustrates that. And it's a predictable containment strategy. Yep. It's a predictable deployed misunderstanding of the dynamics.
But I also felt like, that was one of the things that I felt was so powerful about the notion of bioethics that you're trying to get us to think about. In that notion of predictable failures, what you focus on is multiplicity and intentionality, right? Yeah. And so the predictability is about the fact that it must be repeated in order to become a norm that we are so desensitized to, right, that it can repeat itself over and over again. And that what you're pointing out, Beck, is that multiplicity comes not only in that moment when bodies become identities that are no longer persons, right, do no longer have humanity, but also in that reaction of what our capacity to respond is so narrowed, right, that we begin reproducing the very categories that reduced a body to an identity without humanity.
The Hurricane Katrina victims are a perfect example of this, long past the time when they should have stopped being victims and been people we are helping. We rename them as refugees. We imagine a whole host of events going on in the Superdome that did not happen. We rescue people from some hospitals and not others, and we could predict those. Matter of fact, the people in the hospital said, oh, I knew that the Army was going to rescue people from the private hospitals, but we here at Charity, or even at Memorial, which was the city hospital, we're going to be last on the list. And that bioethics seems to, scoot over these as if every case is new and different is troublesome to me.